This is a Film Stories original podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Skinny Pop Popcorn. Perfectly popped, endlessly delicious. Oh, so light and crunchy. Skinny Pop Original Popcorn is the snack you've been searching for. Made with just 3 simple ingredients: popcorn kernels, sunflower oil, and salt. Snacking never felt or tasted so good. Perfectly popped, endlessly delicious. Give yourself permission to snack and pick up Skinny Pop Original Popcorn today.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by a fellow podcaster. She is a host of The Final Girls and an author and a writer, Anna Bogutskaya. Hi Anna, how are you?
Hello, I'm very good. I'm very glad we managed to make this happen, even though it is at an ungodly hour,
Yeah,
John.
this is a horrific hour. This is like daylight horror at its worst. You wrote a book last year that I really enjoyed, and
Thank you.
It came out last year. And this year, Feeding the Monster: Why Horror Has a Hold on Us feels equally pertinent. Well, I mean, I know why I feel it's pertinent. Why did you feel it was pertinent, and what sort of brought you to the place where you were writing this?
Pertinent to the culture, to this morning in particular.
Well, it feels pretty gruesome this morning. So yes, I mean, with what's happened this week, especially. But
yeah. Well, I actually knew that I wanted to write a book about horror films as I was writing the first book. So my first book, Unlikable Female Characters, has no horror in it at all. It has literally a line that I put in to say that I was not going to cover that much horror in it because it was a whole other universe that allowed for so many more unlikable female characters in it. But that I knew in the back of my mind that I wanted to do something book length on it. I just didn't know what it was going to be yet. I needed to know whether I could even finish a book in the first place, 1, let alone 2. So I sort of purposely took that out of that first book, and it covered TV and film from, the 1930s until literally the morning that I submitted the final draft. But once I had that book done, I started thinking about what I wanted to maybe do with the next one, whether I had another book in me, which is, already a big ask. And I was pretty confident that I knew I wanted to do something in horror, but I needed to figure out what the structure was going to be. And I'm a very structural writer, so I sort of need to know what the outline or the container is going to look like before I start sitting down and writing it, or in case of a book, before I pitch it out to editors. So it took me a few months to just playing around, figuring out what felt right, what seemed like it would sustain my interest for the months that it would take to write a book. With horror in particular, it was sort of an easier but also a more difficult task because on the one hand, I had already done that research. I had been so involved in the genre space for years and years and years that these were all ideas and thoughts and films and filmmakers that I had met or that I had kept aware of, that I had written or spoken about for years. So the heavy lifting of having the knowledge and the research at my fingertips was done. That wasn't the hard part at all. The hard part was figuring out what to say that didn't feel redundant or repetitive or like something that could only exist in a particular moment in time, like an article would. You're responding to something really immediate, but something that had a bit more longevity to it that needed to exist in a book form. And the other pressure was that it was the genre that I had worked in and written and thought and spoken about a lot for a number of years. So I wanted to do it justice for myself. I would be so profoundly embarrassed and saddened and if I felt that I had done a shit job by writing about the one thing that I wanted to, carve out and really take the time and the space to think about and write this, you know, book length love letter to. And there were several structures that I toyed around with. And when I finally landed on the one that is essentially the book, it really didn't change at all from the proposal to the final product. It immediately clicked. And once it clicked, it was really contrary to the first book, really quite a pleasure to write.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the structure is great. You use these sort of nouns: fear, hunger, anxiety, pain, power, and you sort of fit in the movies that you want to address in that way. One of the things that I thought was really interesting about your approach as well is that the fact that it is your passion, means that you also apply a lot of your subjective, your personal approach. I've just finished reading Claire Dederer's Monster, the A Fan's Dilemma, and she talks about these problems with terrible people making great art as being a biography meeting a biography. And I felt that when I was reading your book, I was going, oh, this is a critic's biography meeting the films.
That's an interesting point because I apologize for doing this, John, but this is what we do, isn't it? I'm gonna ask you a
Go
question.
ahead.
Did you did you feel like there was, you mentioned I've also read Claire Dederer's Monsters,
Mm.
and I also really remember that line, and I thought it was really interesting. And one book that I had on my bookshelf as a real totem and something that I not just in the process of writing Feeding the Monster, but even as at all times go back to is Kayla Janice's House of Psychotic Women, which is a critic's biography and a biography of a type of film. And I put a lot more of myself into Feeding the Monster than I did with Unlikable Female Characters. But I wanted to really thread that line of it's really not about me. I'm not that interesting, but there are personal elements there that I thought were relevant to the approach that I wanted to take and really deepen as a critic, as a piece of cultural criticism, that I wanted to make sure that it didn't feel like it was clinical and just being written about from this God's eye perspective of these films are good and you should check them out. And this is why they're good. And they're good because I know them and you must agree with me because I know so much about horror movies.
Here's a new
my
canon sort of thing.
exactly, yeah. So my question to you is, did it feel like a critic's biography, like a biography meeting a biography of a film?
No, I wouldn't say it was that extensive, but I would say that what I like about your point of the God's eye view is that God's eye view is exactly that. It's sort of male white, and that objectivity is often a subjectivity in disguise. So I'm really for people coming up and saying, "Hey, I had a drinking problem, so when I look at when I look at movies about alcohol, I'm approaching it differently to people who haven't had a drinking problem." And I see, particularly in your chapters about women and their bodies, insights that I couldn't have. And I think there is a critical pushback of like, oh, I'm a critic, I can have an insight about everything. And well, no, I can't have an insight from within that experience. I have to listen to, and you make the point about trans films where you say, my insights are going to be limited about this because I'm a chiz writer. So in that sense, I thought it was the correct. And I hope this doesn't sound mealy mouthed, but I thought it was absolutely the correct and appropriate amount of biography, rather than it being a complete biography. It didn't feel intrusive. Put it that way. It felt corrective.
Thank you. No, I appreciate you saying that. And it's always a such a weird balancing act to make, right? Because as a critic, the school of thought, generally speaking, and I don't personally subscribe to this, is that, you have to strive for this, objectivity. And I use air quotes here because I think it's, poppycock. It doesn't exist. You're passing judgment on a piece of art. It's obviously subjective. All writing is subjective. And but there is this assumption that some opinions and some films can be quote unquote objectively good or objectively bad. And I really did not want to do that. I've never wanted to do that and probably don't know how to do that. And in this book in particular, especially because horror has always been wrapped up in a lot of judgment, in a lot of, well, this is good, but for horror, or, this is actually really great, even though it's a horror film and there's some nasty stuff going on, or, there's a ghost, but really it's about a profound thing.
It's about grief.
I've always had a lot.
It's about grief. It's really
It's all about
grief.
trauma, John.
There you go.
It's all about trauma. But I wanted to take that same very, very emotion first, very feeling first, and very generous approach to writing about why and how horror functions and how it is a deeply emotional genre, which is, I think, not usually how people write about horror. They write about the effects, they write about its scares, they write about how successful it can be at being a horror film. But there is such an emotional layer to the genre that I think is implicit to the genre as a whole. And that was essentially my elevator pitch. Once I cracked the structure for myself, I'm like, oh, it's horror films and feelings. And it's a challenge for me to write from that personal, emotional side while also writing cultural criticism. And at the same time, it felt like that was a way that I could connect to the reader, even readers who had not seen these films that I was writing about. And in fact, there's films that I mentioned in the book that I don't personally like. And it does not matter. What matters is that, there is always, even in most films that I don't like personally, I can still see things that are interesting or that are speaking to something or that are trying to go for something that maybe they don't quite succeed as a whole, but they are those sparks in there that feel very valid and very valuable.
Which ones?
I'm not going to say that. And I probably honestly could not remember. At 7:45 in the morning, John, I can barely remember my own name. I'm so glad you did not ask me to introduce myself because that would have messed it up.
Yeah, I mean, that's so one of the things about horror. You mentioned Linda Williams talking about body films, that there are sort of films that make you weep and affect you viscerally, and
Yes.
pornography and horror are the other two major categories for this. And Linda Williams, by the way, was a teacher at the University of Liverpool when I was there. We overlapped.
Amazing.
Yeah. I didn't do her course because...
Did she teach you?
No, I didn't. I had friends who did it, and I was such a bloody idiot because basically her course, she did a course with Jeff Ward called Visions of Excess, and I thought... That is so up my street. I shouldn't do it because I'll do that I'll do that anyway. I should do like Chaucer and stuff that I would never read voluntarily. I should just do, but I would sit in on their lessons. So she did kind of teach me, just never officially. So I'd sit in on like their lessons about David Cronenberg and things like that, and they'd always look at me. They'd look at me oddly, like, who's this guy who didn't? And this was in the very early 90s. So this was Cronenberg of Crash and, good Cronenberg.
That is such a great name for a course.
Yeah.
Visions of Excess.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so tawdry and, thick.
That's what I
love it.
Yeah, there's a stench to it. And that's what I was going to ask you. Is there an element that, like, when you try to spruce up horror, you're scrubbing away a bit of the dirt and the blood and whatnot that actually makes horror attractive? I mean, you make the point that you actually statistically kind of break it down, that how many Oscars and nominations and stuff. And I'm sort of thinking, I don't want my horror movies to win Oscars. The Oscars are shit. I don't want anything I like to be touched by an Oscar.
I don't know. I think we can have both. And I think with horror, actually, I think we can have both because as with any art form, there's a spectrum to it, right? There's the stenchy, scummy side, which I also love a lot, and there's the more polished side. And sometimes with horror, you can get the scummy stuff infiltrate the polished things as well. I do think that there's two things there, isn't there? The Oscars element, I just think is pure snobbery. It's just, you cannot deny that, especially in the past. I mean, it's always been this way, but and there's films that we don't strictly consider horror films right now that I would consider horror films, like Rebecca,
Mm.
the Hitchcock film, or Whatever Happened to Baby Jane or Sunset Boulevard. Those sweeped, they got tons of nominations and in some cases awards. I know that Silence of the Lambs, which won the Big Five, is considered by many to be a thriller, but I'm sorry, there's a guy who eats another guy's face, and there's a someone who makes a suit out of women's skin. That is a horror film, sir. That is 100% a horror film. But I think it's just about recognition. It's all on an industry level, on an awards level, continuously wrapped up in this feeling that it's not worthy. And I think the evidence has mounted for however long cinema has been around, 100 plus years, 120 plus years, that it is absolutely worthy and it's completely intertwined with the evolution of cinema itself. So just consistently ignoring this very wide-ranging genre that has, as I was just saying, everything from the scummy exploitation work to the really, high-end, polished, genre-bending, extremely well-performed stories. Just ignoring that as a bad because you're not looking at them through the same lens as all other films. The amount in the process when you're part of an awards body and you're looking at all of these films and you're judging them and voting for them, obviously there is everyone's personal biases come into play. But if there's a bias that is just to an entire genre that is not even looking at the individual films, I mean, you could argue that comedy suffers from the same kind of derision to a degree. But I think it's still astounding that no matter how culturally relevant, um, thematically progressive, and the amazing roster of both filmmakers and performers that has come up through horror films, that they continue to be consistently ignored in favor of lackluster, mediocre dramas about World War II or whatever. It's just really dispiriting, isn't it? Because it is, I 100% believe it's been the most exciting filmmaking of the past 15 years.
Yeah, yeah, no argument from me there. I mean, one thing I would kind of, it's not really a pushback, but sort of
Mm,
the audience of every other genre, they can like a genre or not like a genre, but they'll sit through the film. I might not like, somebody might not like Westerns. I was going to say, I might not like Westerns. That's crazy. Someone might not like Westerns, but they'll watch
mm.
a Western. They'll not. Whereas there is a significant slither of the audience who will just not watch a horror film from the
Yes.
get-go. And no other genre sort of auto expels a number of people,
Hmm.
except perhaps pornography, and even there I have my doubts.
Mm. No, I think it's sort of exactly what I was alluding to as well. You're absolutely right. It's this thing of people just say, "Oh, it's not for me. I'm not watching that. I won't watch it." And they're essentially denying themselves to this whole roster of creative possibilities. And not all horror films are the same. And I think that refusal to engage with horror as a whole is operating under the assumption that all horror films are exactly the same.
Right.
And they think that all horror films are, let's say, Evil Dead, and Evil Dead is a masterpiece. Don't get me wrong. I'm not slagging off Evil Dead, but they assume it to be jump scary and gory.
Yeah.
That's what they assume it's going to be.
Yeah.
And that is not for them. And there is such, within horror as a space, there are so many subgenres and tones and possibilities to it that just blanket saying, I don't watch horror films. I'm never gonna watch this. I'm not gonna watch, a I'm not gonna watch a Chloe Okuno or Anna Lilian Rapport or Jordan Peele or Robert Eggers film. You know, it's what they're all different.
Right.
Even these handful of filmmakers that I name drop right now from the last decade of films, they're all making very radically different films that have almost nothing to do with one another, but they still all fall under this blanket of horror. So what, you're just gonna ignore them? Ignore the most interesting filmmakers to come out of the past decade?
Yeah, yeah, no, no, yeah, it's successfully pushed back on. This award season, there's a possibility that, Demi Moore is going to pick up at least a nomination, I would argue, for The Substance. And this has been something of a year, an annus mirabilis, if that's the right pronunciation, for horror. You've got Nosferatu coming up. Terrifier 3 has had a huge commercial success and, knocked more mainstream fare off the charts. How and The Substance did well at Cannes. Arguably maybe should have won at Cannes. What's your outlook on those films and this year as a writer in horror?
I think it's, you mean those three films in particular, or the year for horror in general?
Both. Take the first.
Well, nominate Demi Moore.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right.
But then again, I'm biased always in favor of Demi Moore because I have loved her since I was a little girl and I saw Now and Then, and I think she's an extraordinary actress, an amazing movie star. We've got so few of those. And I think she's incredible. I think she's the best thing about The Substance. Her performance is so wild and so vulnerable. I haven't seen Terrifier 3, but I have seen Terrifier 1 and 2, so I've basically seen Terrifier 3.
Yeah, I think so.
Happy for them to rake in. I'm always happy for a horror film to rake in. It's not my cup of horror tea, but I'm always happy for a killer clown to knock off some drama off the box office top 10. But I think even those three, Nosferatu, The Substance, and Terrifier 3, are so different from one another. Even clustering them together feels odd because those three films have nothing to do with each other thematically, aesthetically, in the way that they're going to be positioned and promoted, in the way they're going to be spoken about. I mean, Nosferatu is not out yet, obviously, so we'll see, but we've had trailers, we've had some conversation pop up about it. And isn't that just a great example of the fact that not all horror films are made equal, and it is completely unfair to talk about them as a big blob of horror because Nosferatu is diametrically opposed to Terrifier 3.
Yes.
As is The Substance. As is, I don't know, what else came out this year?
Was Infinity Pool this year, or was that last year? Was that last year?
No, that was a couple of years ago. I think that was 2022.
Right. Oh my God, that was ages ago.
I know.
Yonks.
Yeah.
We're now both checking Letterboxd to see what came out this year from our.
We really, really are.
I mean, while we do, I'll tell you something else then that sort of goes with what you say in terms of. For me, my enthusiasm, I mean, I don't know. I don't really have a favorite genre. I do love Westerns, do love science fiction. I love comedies, obviously. I always try to stick comedies in my top 10 whenever I can. But there's nothing that gets me quite as excited as a good horror film. There's nothing gets me quite as excited as a bad horror film. If I start hearing, "Oh, you've got to go and see this," it's not great, but it's got this idea to it. And I think horror is one of the few genres where the biggest special effect is a good idea. The biggest pull is there's this idea. And so Talk to Me or Inner Violent Nature. I think Inner Violent Nature, which did come out this year, I think.
It did actually, yeah.
No, now
I was just checking.
now you're going to say, no, that was 1998. COVID has really bled into my brain, hasn't it?
Also this year, the return of Josh Hartnett in Trap.
Ah,
Very
right.
good time.
Which I haven't seen.
And Jane Chamberlain's I Saw the TV Glow.
Oh, of course, yeah, which I have seen, which is a great film, which is
Phenomenal film.
yeah. I mean, there's a film that you could watch and not even think it was a horror film, and it is a horror film.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both. It's operating on multiple levels.
Absolutely. So yeah, so like that idea of a horror movie having at its heart a sort of theme or an idea that is I think that goes very much with your book, because you have these big ideas like Cannibals suddenly becoming very popular, and then these ideas that are the sort of the way that is visualized in the film, such as what if we made a coming of age story about a young teenager who happens to be a cannibal.
Um, so I think that you started off by talking about bad horror movies, and I just wanted to mention, I don't know if you feel the same way, John, but I try I try to go into films hoping that they're going to be great. There's always room for disappointment, as there is with many things in life. But every time I sit down to watch a film, horror or otherwise, I don't want it to be bad. I really want it to succeed. I really wanted to love it. And so I'm sort of like, I know it's a really popular thing. I'm not really the sort of person who enjoys going to see something because I expect it to be schlocky. I think, like, much like you were mentioning, I really want to find that kernel of greatness, even in something that maybe isn't doesn't really succeed on other terms. But to your other point about, you know, these big ideas, I genuinely prefer films that have more than one idea in
Right.
them. I think there's room for more than one. Uh, and there's in when I was writing the book, the way that those chapters are structured, and for some of your listeners who, I don't expect them to have picked up or read the book, it's essentially five big chapters, and they're structured around feelings, hunger, pain, anxiety, fear, and power. And I know power is not a feeling, but power is a very big idea that horror, and I would say almost everything, circles around in one way or another. And instead of ideas, I was always thinking of those chapter headings as guiding feelings. So those were the containers for the ideas that I wanted to explore, but they all came back and related back to the emotional. My elevator pitch, like I mentioned before, was horror films and feelings, and that was the thing that was guiding me. It wasn't so much about breaking the films down into their ideas, because there's so many ways you could do that, and each, a lot of the films that I write about contain a multiplicity of ideas, and you can talk about them in so many different ways, and they would all be correct. I wanted to more approach them and write about them from an emotional lens, and in a way to try and prove to the reader or deepen their understanding of those horror films as not just films that succeeded in scaring them or succeeded in making them jump or making them irksome or, freaking them out or grossing them out in some way, but that held at their heart a really strong investment in the emotional life of their characters, and by extension that were really concerned with human emotion as opposed to just, big bombastic effect scene. Um, so those are kind of, if you want to call them ideas, kind of those are my central ideas that guided every single one of the chapters. And obviously all those feelings are very big and very extreme, but also very recognizable to everyone. Everybody's experienced fear at some point. Everyone's experienced hunger or pain in one degree or another. So they're not, convoluted, complicated expressions of feelings to try, that you have to do a lot of work to try to empathize with. And by centering those, what I wanted to do is kind of draw the reader a little bit closer to horror as a genre too, because I think going back to that immediate knee-jerk rejection of horror as a genre as a whole, I think part of that rejection comes from this idea that it's not a genre that feels human or relatable or at all connected with everyday experience. And I just don't think that's true. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to bucket these chapters in that way as well, is to point out how those things can be those if we think about horror through this more emotional critical lens, it can so deeply connect to the experiences of a lot of people. And that's also one of the reasons why people keep going back and are so evangelical about the genre, much like I am doing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, rightly so. And yeah, I mean, that's a much better way of phrasing it. Who knew you wrote the book? I mean, like what I was saying about the cannibals, of course, you put in the chapter about hunger, and everybody knows what hunger feels like, and everybody knows like what wanting to bite a baby feels like as well. If you ever hugged a baby and smelled a baby, the immediate urge to bite it.
I don't know what that feels like, John. I've never wanted to bite a baby. What are you talking about?
Okay, I'll edit that bit out then, because I assumed that was everybody. Isn't that everybody? Doesn't everybody want to eat a baby occasionally?
I don't know, mate. I've never heard of anyone wanting to bite the head of a baby.
Okay, well, there's this. There's this urge that comes on people when it comes to cuddly stuff that you just want to you want to hug it to death. You want to consume it, and then
yes.
Okay, so that's what I'm referring to. I hope that's I hope some of our audience are going, Anna, what are you talking about? We all bite babies. Come on.
Is this the Cannibal podcast?
This is the part of the podcast where we move on to the section on monsters, in which you reveal that the monster is actually me. But no, I did seriously want to move on to this idea of the monster itself, which there's a line in the book that you say, oh, these aren't really our monsters, these are boomers' monsters, and you refer to Freddy Krueger and people like that, sort of coming back again and again and again. Although I would argue that might be Generation X's monsters rather than boomers' monsters. But anyway, we all divide it differently, perhaps.
Fair enough. Yeah, no, that could track.
And your point, Art the Clown maybe becoming a monster who is having a certain traction right now, and that would be interesting in and of itself, because I find him very much a kind of empty space, really. He's just like a killing cipher, I don't feel he has any personality or sexuality or anything at all. And so in a way, it's just feels like, what's the word? A sort of a MacGuffin, he's a MacGuffin made flesh. But I was interested in this idea that we don't really have monsters. And I wanted you to expand on that a little bit for our listeners.
Well, it's sort of, if the book has any thesis, which I hope it does, one of them is the fact that we're severely lacking in monsters. And I find that really interesting because, and when I say monsters, obviously there's been movies that have monsters in them. We can name a whole bunch, from like Smile to obviously Terrifier to, new versions of familiar books or stories, like obviously the 2 chapters that Annie Muschietti directed with Pennywise. Again, I wanted to make the distinctions of monsters that we created in the last 10, 15 years, as opposed to were adaptations previous monsters that already existed in the culture before. We put a new outfit on Pennywise, but Pennywise is still a monster from the 80s. And there's a few of them, obviously. There's Abigail, there's Vecna from Stranger Things. There's a bunch of others. There's obviously the monster from the clown from Terrifier. But I don't think they have a cultural hold on us in a way that, in the 1930s, a Dracula and a Frankenstein had, or the original Universal monsters, or the way that those Boomer or Gen X monsters, whichever way you want to interpret them, like Freddy and Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees, they they became icons. They became emblematic of a time. And they were until they became funny and spoofed and went into weird rune directions. They were truly terrifying. Like nobody was fucking around with Michael Myers. Even though he didn't speak that much, he was phenomenally scary. And sure, now he's mostly known for doing thirst dances on TikTok, but I think one thing that we have sort of lost is that reverence for the monsters. So when they come up, when a new monster comes up, in a nanosecond, they're a meme. And actually, I think, the point you make about the clown from Terrifier, the being an empty space is quite an interesting one because I just don't think of him as a monster. I think he is conceived as a joke.
Yeah.
He is meant to be funny. It is meant to be sort of weird and funny to see this clown who looks like a goth clown, which is the only kind of clown that I would personally accept because I hate clowns. It's and then he's just murdering people. For none of it is, it's just spoof, it's sketches, it's killing sketches, right?
Right.
There's no thematic or narrative thread. It's just one scene after another, and then you make three movies and a whole lot of money. Good for everyone involved. But I think again, it doesn't generate fear. It's not like seeing Freddy Krueger menacing your dreams and children's dreams, right? It's not like Michael Myers being this unstoppable, possibly supernatural machine that is just like going after this one teenage girl. Even, the unseen monster in It Follows. It's terrifying. This idea that something can slowly but surely follow you around and is so committed to grabbing you, to killing you, and you can never even see its face is so profoundly scary. And we just don't have those figures, who are they're unseen or they're memes. Even some of the originals that were very heavily marketed, like Abigail, the little sorry, excuse me, Megan. There's two killer tiny girls. There's Abigail and there's Megan. Megan is the AI cyborg girl who's a killing machine, and Abigail is the vampire girl who's also a killing machine. But they instantly become memes. In fact, they're marketed as memes to begin with. So people are trying to, the studios are trying to incite us to go see this horror movie with a potentially great new villain with memes about the villain. Like the whole campaign for Megan, if you remember, was Megan doing the dance, the TikTok, the Megan dance. There was, pop-ups everywhere with little girls doing the creepy killing machine dance. She was on TikTok every day for weeks. So by the time you get to the movie to see her, you're there for the joke. You're in on the joke. You're not there to be genuinely scared by her. And that is what I mean by the lack of monsters, is that we're not really scared of them. We don't have that reverence for them. And also I think, monsters are a cultural product. They tell us about the time and the place and the people who create those monsters because they tell us what we consider to be monstrous, what we consider to be other, what we consider to be scary. And the fact that we're just creating monsters to make fun of them, I think is quietly revealing about ourselves as a culture.
Because there's nothing, it's not like the world isn't terrifying. It's not like there's not stuff in the world that we couldn't talk about via horror that would be utterly monstrous.
Exactly. And we constantly do talk about, society and our cultural fears through horror. But I think the characters that I can think of that have been the scariest over the last, decade plus have been very righteous people as opposed to the killer clowns or the killer cyborg girls.
Absolutely. And it is interesting that the sort of the most successful, at least for me, remaking of those universal horror classics was The Invisible Man. And it wasn't even,
Oh,
was utterly, obviously invisible.
But and that was, oh gosh, spoiler. Oh, I don't want to spoil the movie because if anyone hasn't seen it, it's so good. You should absolutely see it. But yes, it's an invisible man, but at the end of the day, it's also just a man. It's a man, it's a scientist. It's not a supernatural creature.
Exactly. And it's sort of like how, yeah, yeah. I mean, you could definitely read it as sort of masculinity at its most toxic, with the benefits of massive technological wealth behind them. And, I wonder if there's a figure around that like that today. I don't know. I know. Maybe not. I don't want to jump. Listen, Anna, I know you've got a hard out. I could listen to you and talk to you about this book for another 2 hours. So hurry up and write another book so I can talk to you again.
I'm on it. I'm on it, dude. It's happening. We'll do this again in another year or two.
Excellent. And congratulations. I really enjoyed your book. It was really good fun.
Thank you so much, John.